April 1945. The island of Okinawa had become one of the most violent battlefields of the Pacific War. Volcanic ridges stretched across the landscape like the broken spine of the earth itself. Mud filled the trenches. Smoke drifted across shattered hills. The air carried the constant smell of gunpowder, burning fuel, and wet soil torn open by artillery shells. For weeks, the thunder of war had never stopped. But on the morning of April 22nd, something unusual happened. The artillery suddenly fell silent. For the soldiers hiding in caves and foxholes across the island, that silence felt more frightening than the explosions that came before it. Inside a narrow limestone cave carved into the hillside, a young Japanese infantry corporal named Teeshi Yamamoto knelt beside a wounded soldier. His uniform was stained with dirt and blood. In front of him, his comrade lay on the ground with a shattered leg. The bone had broken through the flesh, and the bleeding refused to stop. Yamamoto tore a piece from his own uniform and pressed it against the wound. His hands trembled, not only from fear, but from exhaustion. The battle for Okinawa had already lasted weeks. Food was scarce. Water was limited. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Most Japanese soldiers on the island understood a painful truth. They had been sent there to die. Outside the cave, the battlefield stretched across the valley below. Yamamoto carefully leaned forward and looked through the narrow opening in the rock. Across the valley, he could see the American lines. Rows of olive-colored tents were arranged with strange precision. Trucks moved slowly between supply points. Soldiers walked calmly between positions as if the battlefield itself had become an enormous factory. Everything appeared organized, controlled, mechanical. Then Yamamoto noticed something strange. A small aircraft appeared above the ridge. It approached slowly, hovering in a way that no airplane could. For a moment, Yamamoto wondered if he was imagining it. But then the aircraft descended toward the American front line. Within seconds it touched the ground. Several soldiers rushed forward carrying stretchers. Moments later, the aircraft lifted into the air again and disappeared behind the ridge. A helicopter. Yamamoto had heard rumors about such machines, but seeing one in combat felt almost unreal. Every few minutes another one appeared. Hover. Land. Lift the wounded. Disappear. Over and over again. The machines moved through the sky like mechanical insects collecting injured soldiers from the battlefield. Yamamoto watched silently. Something about what he was seeing did not match what he had been taught. During his training, instructors constantly repeated the same message. America was weak. Americans were soft. They lacked the spiritual strength of Japanese warriors. If Japanese soldiers fought with enough determination, the enemy would collapse under pressure. But nothing Yamamoto saw that morning looked weak. Instead, he saw a powerful military machine working with calm efficiency. The helicopters did not carry weapons. They carried wounded soldiers. Flying ambulances. Machines dedicated not to killing the enemy, but to saving their own men. And that idea disturbed him more than artillery ever could. For most of human history, wounded soldiers faced a grim reality. When men were injured on the battlefield, survival depended largely on luck. Medical care was slow. Transportation was slower. In earlier wars, wounded soldiers often spent hours, or even days, being carried away from the front lines. Many died during that journey. Bleeding, infection, shock. These were the silent killers of war. Even during the First World War, when modern medicine had begun to improve, battlefield evacuation remained slow and dangerous. Ambulances struggled through destroyed roads. Horse-drawn wagons carried wounded soldiers across muddy fields. Time was always the enemy, and time almost always won. Military planners understood the problem. Some had even suggested using aircraft to transport wounded soldiers. But early airplanes were fragile machines. They could barely carry their own pilots, let alone injured men on stretchers. The idea remained mostly theoretical, until technology finally caught up with imagination. The helicopter represented something entirely new. Unlike airplanes, helicopters could land almost anywhere. A small clearing, a mountain ridge, a narrow strip of ground behind the front lines. The United States began experimenting with these aircraft during the later years of World War II. One of the earliest operational models was the Sikorsky R-4. Compared to modern helicopters, it was extremely simple. It was slow. It carried only a few passengers, and it struggled in bad weather. But it possessed one revolutionary advantage. It could hover. That single ability allowed helicopters to reach places that no other aircraft could. For wounded soldiers trapped in remote or dangerous terrain, that ability meant survival. The United States first tested helicopter evacuation missions in the China-Burma-India theater during 1944. American pilots used the machines to rescue injured soldiers from jungle terrain where roads did not exist. The results surprised even military planners. Wounded men who would have died during long ground transport were suddenly reaching hospitals in time for surgery. The experiment was a success. By 1945, helicopters began appearing in the Pacific Island campaigns. Okinawa would become one of the earliest battlefields where helicopter evacuation demonstrated its full potential. On that single island, hundreds of wounded soldiers were transported from frontline aid stations to surgical hospitals. What once took hours now required only minutes. And those minutes changed everything. The helicopter was only one part of a much larger system. The American military had constructed an enormous network designed to move wounded soldiers quickly through multiple stages of medical care. The system began at the battlefield itself. Combat medics rushed forward under fire to treat injured soldiers. They carried morphine for pain relief, bandages to control bleeding, and plasma to replace lost blood. Once stabilized, the wounded were transported to battalion aid stations located near the front lines. From there, ambulances carried them to larger clearing stations where surgeons could perform emergency procedures. Behind those stations stood field hospitals equipped with X-ray machines, blood supplies, and surgical teams working around the clock. Further back, hospital ships waited offshore. Transport planes carried patients to larger medical centers across the Pacific. It was an enormous logistical system built for one purpose: to rescue wounded soldiers before death could claim them. For Japanese soldiers observing this system, the difference in philosophy was impossible to ignore. The Imperial Japanese Army had developed under very different circumstances. Resources were limited. Logistics were difficult. Military culture emphasized sacrifice and endurance. A wounded soldier was expected to continue fighting if possible. If he could not recover, death was often considered an honorable outcome. Saving wounded soldiers was important, but not at the expense of military resources. America approached the problem differently. American planners believed that every wounded soldier represented a valuable asset. A soldier saved today could fight again in the future, or train new recruits, or contribute to the war effort at home. Saving lives was not only humane, it was practical. This philosophy produced remarkable results. During World War II, the United States achieved one of the lowest battlefield fatality rates in military history. Only a small percentage of wounded soldiers died from their injuries. In earlier conflicts, that number had been far higher. Advances in antibiotics, blood transfusions, surgical techniques, and rapid evacuation all contributed to the improvement. But the helicopter became the most visible symbol of this transformation. It represented speed, technology, and a military system capable of protecting its soldiers even in the chaos of war. Back in his cave overlooking the battlefield, Corporal Yamamoto could not understand the full scale of what he was witnessing. He only understood the contrast. The Americans were sending machines into danger to rescue wounded men. His own army had sent him to Okinawa with limited supplies and little expectation of survival. Many Japanese soldiers believed they would never leave the island alive. Watching the helicopters rise and fall above the battlefield forced Yamamoto to confront a painful realization. The enemy valued its soldiers differently. 3 days later, Yamamoto attempted to surrender. According to accounts from nearby soldiers, a Japanese officer saw him approaching American lines. Before Yamamoto could reach safety, the officer shot him. For many Japanese soldiers during the final months of the war, surrender remained forbidden. Yet the sight of helicopters rescuing wounded men had planted a dangerous idea. Perhaps survival was possible. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. The helicopters flying above Okinawa were not intended as propaganda. They were simply tools of medical evacuation. But to the soldiers watching them from caves and trenches, they carried a powerful message. They revealed a new kind of military strength. A strength built not only on weapons and firepower, but on the ability to preserve life even during war. That quiet revolution in battlefield medicine would influence military strategy for decades to come. and long after the guns of World War II fell silent, the image of helicopters lifting wounded soldiers from the battlefield would remain one of the most enduring symbols of modern warfare.